The board has voted, and the vote stands. As of tonight, the cabin and the 4 acres under it belong to the association. You can take it up with our attorney, but you will be removing your personal effects by the end of the month. That was Diane Sutter, president of the Pinecrest Ridge Homeowners Association, reading from a single sheet of paper at a folding table in the community clubhouse, telling a room full of my neighbors that they had just transferred my family's land to themselves by a show of hands. My name is Walter Brandt. I am 61 years old, a retired county land surveyor, and the cabin she was talking about was built by my grandfather in 1948 on ground my family has held since before the subdivision around it even existed. What Diane did not know, what she never once bothered to check in the 3 years she spent trying to take it, was that I had run the original boundary survey for that subdivision myself in 1981, and that my 4 acres had never been inside the association's plat at all. The legal description she was reading from described land that did not include mine. She was holding a vote on property she had no more claim to than the moon. So when she finished reading, and the room went quiet, and she looked at me with that thin, satisfied smile, I just folded my hands on the table and waited. If you had spent 30 years learning exactly where the lines on the ground really fall, and a woman in a coral blazer told a room you had to be off your own grandfather's porch by the 30th, what would you have done? I want to take you back to the beginning, because the vote was not the start of it. The vote was the last step on a staircase Diane had been climbing for 3 years, and every step of it is sitting in a green binder on my kitchen table right now. I moved back to the cabin full-time in the spring after my wife Carol passed. We had kept it as a weekend place for most of our marriage, driving up from the valley on Friday nights with the windows down. And Carol had loved it more than any house we ever owned. She had a chair on the porch, a green wooden Adirondack with the paint worn off the armrests where her hands went. And she used to sit there at first light with her coffee and watch the sun come down the ridge in a long bar of gold that moved across the pasture like water filling a low place. She told me once that she did not care about the valley house at all, that the cabin was where she actually lived, and the valley was just where she slept on weeknights. Near the end, when she was thin and tired, and we both knew, she took my hand on that porch and made me promise that I would not sell the place to anyone for any reason. I told her I would not. She made me say it twice, looking at her, so she would know I meant it. That is the kind of promise a man keeps, even when keeping it costs him. And there were 3 years coming when keeping it would cost me plenty. The cabin sits on 4 acres at the top of a gravel road, with pine forest on 3 sides and a long pasture sloping down toward the rest of the development. My grandfather logged the road in by hand in the years after the war, dropping the trees himself and dragging the stumps out with a borrowed mule team. And he poured the foundation 1 bag at a time off the back of a flatbed because there was no ready-mix truck that would climb the grade. His name is on the original deed, recorded in the county in 1948, describing the parcel by meets and bounds that start at an iron pin he set at the northeast corner of the property, a length of 3/4-inch rebar he drove down until only the cap showed. That pin is still there. I have stood next to it 100 times, the first time when I was 9 years old, and my grandfather walked me out to it and put my hand on the cold cap of it and told me that this, right here, was where our family started and where it ended, and that as long as I knew where this pin was, nobody could ever tell me I was standing on their land. I know its coordinates now to the 100th of a foot. I have known them my whole working life. A boundary is not an opinion. It is a fact you can walk to. Pinecrest Ridge came along 33 years later, A developer bought the big ranch downhill from us and platted it into 90 lots with covenants and an association, and the county hired me to run the boundary survey for the plat. I walked every line of that subdivision. And when I tied it to the existing parcels, I made very sure that my family's 4 acres were drawn as an exception, an inholding outside the association's boundary, because they were never part of the ranch the developer bought. The plat I signed and the county recorded shows my parcel as a notch cut out of the northwest corner of Pinecrest Ridge. Outside, separate, not theirs. For 30 years, that fact sat quiet, because nobody ever questioned it. My grandfather paid his own taxes, my father after him, and then me. We were never members of the association, never paid $1 in dues, never asked to. The cabin was simply the old place at the top of the road that predated everything. Then Diane Sutter got elected president, and Diane Sutter wanted the top of the road. I first met her on a Tuesday in March, 3 years back, when she came up my gravel drive in a white SUV with a vanity plate that read PRES1, parked it crooked across my turnaround, and got out in a coral blazer and white sneakers that had never seen gravel before that morning. She picked her way across the loose stone like a woman crossing a creek on stepping stones, arms out for balance. And I watched her from under the hood of my truck and thought that here was somebody who had never once in her life walked a property line. She had a clipboard held against her chest like a breastplate. She had a younger man with her, soft-handed, in a polo shirt with a little embroidered logo on the chest, who hung back by the SUV and turned out to be the association's compliance coordinator. "Mr. Brent," she said, walking up like she owned the porch. "I'm Diane Sutter, president of the Pinecrest Ridge HOA. We need to talk about bringing this property into compliance." I was changing the oil in my truck. I had the drain plug out and a pan under it, and my hands were black to the wrist. I wiped them on a rag, slow, and looked at her. "This property isn't in your association," I said. She smiled the way people smile when they have already decided you are wrong. A patient, closed little smile, like she was waiting for a slow child to finish a sentence. "Everything on the ridge is functionally part of our jurisdiction," she said. "Your driveway connects to our road. Your runoff crosses our common area. We've been very patient about the condition of this place, Mr. Brandt. But the board feels it's time we addressed it properly." I told her, level as I could, that her road dead-ended at my property line because my grandfather had built the original track by hand and deeded the county an access easement for it, and that nothing about my 4 acres had ever been inside her plat. I pointed up at the corner of the pasture where the iron pins sat in the grass and told her that was my line, recorded and certified, and that her boundary stopped a good ways short of it. I offered plainly to drive down to the recorder's office with her right then and show her the plat with my own seal on it. She was not interested in the recorded survey. She looked at my hands and my truck and the unpainted board on the porch step I had not gotten around to replacing. And she told me she would be sending a formal notice, and she turned and picked her way back across the gravel. The coordinator opened her door for her. She backed the SUV in a hard arc to turn around and put both rear wheels straight through Carol's flower bed, the one by the bottom of the steps, and crushed every plant in it flat. And she did not so much as glance in the mirror. That was incident 1. I wrote it down that night on a legal pad at the kitchen table. The date, the time, the vanity plate, the 7 minutes of conversation as near to word for word as I could get it, and the flower bed. Carol used to tease me that I would survey my own grave before they buried me, that I would set a pin at the head and a pin at the foot, and write the bearing between them in a notebook. The habit of writing everything down is the one thing 30 years of property law beats into a man. You do not argue with people like Diane. You do not raise your voice, and you do not threaten, and you do not try to win the conversation in the driveway. You write it down, and you date it, and you file. The first notice came 9 days later. It was a printed letter on heavy association letterhead with a little engraved pine tree at the top, informing me that my property was in violation of 7 separate covenants, including unapproved exterior materials, an unpermitted outbuilding, an improper fence, and failure to maintain community aesthetic standards. It assessed a fine of $200 and a daily penalty of $50 until the violations were cured. I read it twice at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. Then I put it in a manila folder labeled Pinecrest in black marker. And I sat down and wrote a single calm letter back, 2 paragraphs, stating that my parcel was not subject to the association's covenants, citing the recorded plat by its book and page number and the deed by its instrument number, and offering once more to meet at the recorder's office. I sent it certified mail with a return receipt requested. I kept a copy of the letter, and I stapled the green return receipt card to it when it came back with her office's stamp on it. That stapled card mattered later more than I knew at the time. It proved she had received the facts and chosen to ignore them. She did not respond to the substance. She never once, in 3 years, responded to the substance. 3 weeks later, a second notice arrived, with the fines compounded and a new line at the bottom warning that continued non-compliance could result in a lien against the property. That was the first time I felt the thing I would feel many times over the next 3 years, a slow heat starting behind the sternum and climbing into my neck. The kind of anger you have to walk off in the pasture before you can sit down and file calmly. So that is what I did. I walked the fence line all the way to the iron pin and back, twice in the dark, until my hands unclenched, and then I came in and added the second notice to the folder. Carol's flower bed was still flattened. I had not replanted it yet. I could not somehow bring myself to do it while that woman was still backing over the memory of it every week in my mind. By the end of that first summer, the fines on paper had crossed $4,000, and the manila folder had grown fat enough that I moved everything into a 3-ring binder, a green one, because green was the color of the surveyor's field books I had carried my whole career. I had also driven down to the county recorder's office on a slow Wednesday and pulled certified copies of 3 things: my grandfather's 1948 deed, the 1981 subdivision plat with my signature and seal in the lower corner, and the access easement my grandfather had granted the county for the road. I had the clerk seal each one and stamp the date. I did not wave them at anyone. I did not photograph them and send them to Diane in triumph. I slid them into plastic sleeves, in order, at the front of the binder, where they would wait. The binder lived on the kitchen table where Carol's coffee cup used to sit. And I will tell you, there were mornings I looked at that green spine and felt her there, telling me to keep my temper and keep my records and let the paper do what paper does. I want to be plain about something here, because it matters to the lesson at the end. I was not collecting weapons. I was keeping records, the way I had kept records my whole working life. Because a documented fact is the only thing that does not change its story when the pressure comes. If you take one thing from me tonight, start there. The second year, Diane escalated, and she escalated in a way that told me there was money behind her smile. It started with my daughter. My daughter, Reese, was 17 that year, living with me at the cabin after Carol passed, finishing her senior year at the high school down in the valley. She was a steady kid, watchful, quiet, the kind who notices the things other people walk past. She had her mother's habit of going still and paying attention instead of reacting. One afternoon in April, she called me at the hardware store where I was buying fence staples, and her voice was tight and low. "Dad, there's a man taking pictures of the house. He's standing right at the gate with a camera and a clipboard, and he won't tell me who he is. I asked him through the door, and he just kept shooting." I kept my own voice easy so hers would come down. I told her to stay inside, lock the front and the back, and go up to her bedroom window and start recording him on her phone, wide enough to get the truck and the plate, and to narrate the time out loud so it was on the audio. She did it. She filmed that man for 11 straight minutes, calm as her mother would have been, and you can hear her on the recording saying the time, 3:09, 3:15, in a flat little voice. The man wore a hard hat and a yellow vest with no agency name anywhere on it, no county seal, no company logo. He paced my whole fence line. He photographed the outbuilding from 6 different angles. He set up a tripod with what I recognized, even on a phone screen, as a survey-grade instrument, and he shot the corners of my pasture. Then he folded it all up and left in an unmarked white truck with the mud deliberately smeared, I would swear, across the plate. When I got home, Reese handed me her phone without a word and watched my face. We sat at the kitchen table and watched all 11 minutes twice, and then we backed the file up to 2 separate drives that night. The way I back up everything, because 1 copy is a story, and 2 copies are a record. The man, it turned out weeks later when I had a friend in the business quietly ask around, was no county inspector at all. He was a survey assistant working for a private outfit, and the survey he was trying to run was not for any public purpose. It was for a development company. And the development company, I learned the same afternoon, had 3 weeks earlier hired a new head of land acquisition, a man named Greg Sutter, Diane Sutter's husband. That was the day the whole shape of the thing turned over in my hands like a stone, and I saw what had been crawling underneath it all along. This was not a woman who hated my fence or my unpainted porch step. This was a woman whose husband stood to make a great deal of money if my 4 acres, the highest and most buildable ground on the entire ridge, the one parcel with a long, unobstructed view straight down the valley, could be pried loose from me and folded into a development parcel and sold as premium lots. The fines, the notices, the man with the tripod. None of it was ever about community standards. It was the method. The land was the point. It had been the point since the Tuesday she crushed the flower bed. I did not say any of this to Reese. She was 17 and carrying her mother's absence and a senior year. And she did not need to carry a land scheme too. I told her she had done exactly right, better than right, and I made her favorite dinner, chicken and the rice she liked. And we ate on the porch in the last of the light. After she went to bed, I sat alone with the binder and added a page in my own shorthand. Incident 11. The unmarked truck, the smeared plate, the 11-minute video on 2 drives. And underneath it, pressed down hard enough to dent the next page, the name of the development company and the name of the man it had hired, and the date he was hired, 3 weeks before a stranger stood at my gate photographing my corners. The day and time stamps in that binder read like a slow drumbeat across that second year. A Thursday in April, the fake inspector at the gate. A Saturday in June. When Diane came partway up my drive on foot with 3 board members behind her and stood at the bend where the gravel turns and shouted up at the house in front of all of them, I came out onto the porch and let her shout. "You are stealing the views of an entire community, Mr. Brandt," she called up, her finger out, jabbing the air toward my roofline. "That ridge belongs to all of us, and you are sitting on it like a squatter, and you will answer for it." I told her, one sentence, that she was standing on a private road and was welcome to leave by it. She did not leave for a while. She stood there working the board members up, gesturing at my pasture, at my outbuilding, at the long view she kept calling community property. And Reese filmed it from the window because by then, filming was simply what we did. Incident 14. A Monday in August, when two of my oldest clients, men who had paid me to walk their own boundaries 20 years back and stayed friends, called within the same week to say they had each received a letter from the association warning that doing business with me could expose them to liability under some covenant or other. She was reaching into my livelihood now, into the small surveying work I still took on for neighbors to keep my hand in. Incident 19. Each one dated, each one filed, each one another sworn or written act by a woman who had never read the deed. In the middle of that second year, I had a conversation that I want to tell you about, because it was the first time anyone in a uniform stood on my porch, and because it shows you how the law actually works, which is not the way people think. A sheriff's deputy named Tom Alvarez came up the road on a Wednesday evening in response to a complaint Diane had filed, claiming I had threatened her. I had not threatened anyone. I had told her, across the gate, to put her concerns in writing and send them to the county, which is the least threatening sentence in the English language. A complaint had been filed, though, and so a deputy had to come. Tom was maybe 40, careful, polite. He stood on my porch with his thumbs in his belt and told me he did not think I had done anything, but that he was required to follow up on a filed complaint regardless of how thin it looked. "Here's the thing, Mr. Brandt," he said. "She files, I roll. That's how it works. I can't make it stop from my end. What stops it is a record. You keep building that record, every contact, dates, times, what was said. And the day this lands in front of someone who can actually rule on it, your paper does the talking." He looked at the binder on the table through the screen door, and something in his face eased. "Looks like you're already ahead of me." He told me, before he left, that what I needed was a documented pattern, that one incident is a he said, she said, but 20 incidents with dates is a case. I told him I was at 19. He nodded slowly and wrote his own report, and I added his visit to the binder. Incident 20. The deputy on the porch. The pattern he named. That conversation changed how I carried the whole thing. Tom had given me a number to count toward without meaning to. Every escalation after that was not just an insult to absorb. It was another brick in a wall Diane was building around her own position, and I was simply the one keeping count. The third year is when she stopped being careful, and when the binder stopped being a defense and started being a noose, she was tying herself. In the spring of that third year, the association's attorney filed a formal lien against my property for accumulated fines that had, on paper, crossed $11,000. A lien is a serious thing. People hear the word and think of paperwork, but a lien is a hook the law lets one party sink into another party's land, and it follows the land, and it can choke a sale or a loan or an inheritance for years. A lien says the association has a legal interest in your property. It also requires, to be valid, that the property actually fall under the association's authority. And to record it, the attorney had to swear, in a signed instrument before the county, that it did. He swore that my 4 acres were subject to the Pinecrest Ridge covenants. That sworn statement, I knew the moment a copy reached my mailbox, was the mistake that would end all of this, because it was false, and it was in writing, and it was signed. And a signature on a false statement to a county recorder is a different animal entirely from a rude letter on pretty letterhead. I took the lien filing down to the county recorder myself the next morning. I sat at the long oak counter with a clerk I had known and trusted for 20 years, a patient, careful woman named Joan, who had pulled 1,000 plats for me over the decades and knew a clean record from a dirty one at a glance. I asked her to pull the recorded plat for Pinecrest Ridge, and she did. the big linen-backed sheet, and we laid the lien's legal description next to the plat's legal description, side by side on the counter under the lamp. I read them both aloud, slow. The lien described a parcel that began at a point inside the subdivision boundary and closed inside it. My deed and the recorded plat described a parcel that began at my grandfather's iron pin outside the subdivision in the notch cut from the northwest corner. They did not match. They could not be made to match. Joan went quiet, the way she does when she has found something she does not like, and she put one finger on each description and looked from one to the other for a long moment. Then she looked up at me over her glasses. "Walt," she said quietly, so the line behind me would not hear. "They've recorded a lien against land that isn't in their association. Somebody swore to something that isn't true. To us. In this building." I asked her to certify both descriptions and the plat, date stamped, and to make a note in the file that the descriptions did not match. She did all of it, her stamp coming down hard 3 times, and she slid the certified copies across the counter to me in a folder. I added every page to the green binder that night, in order, in sleeves, behind the deed and the plat. I did not call Diane. I did not call her attorney. I did not post a word about it anywhere or tell a single neighbor, though by then a few of them had started to nod at me at the hardware store in a way they had not before. I drove home, made dinner for Reese, and waited, because I knew Diane was not finished. A woman who has sworn a false thing to take a man's land does not stop because the land does not want to be taken. And I knew, with the cold certainty of a man who has read 10,000 legal descriptions, that the worse she made it from here, the cleaner the ending would be. She was not finished. The crossing into something genuinely illegal came on a Friday morning in early autumn. I had driven Reese to school and gone on to the hardware store. My phone rang at 9:40. It was my neighbor Hank, an older man 2 lots down who had never liked the association. "Walt," he said, and I could hear an engine behind his voice. "You better get up here. There's a crew at your gate. They've got a machine." I drove up the ridge faster than I should have on that road, the truck sliding a little on the loose stone at the bends. When I came around the last turn, I saw a flatbed truck parked across my drive, a small tracked excavator already off the trailer and idling, and 3 men in vests bent over my gate with bolt cutters working at the chain. Diane was there, in a coral blazer, standing beside a pickup with her husband's company name on the door, directing the men with one finger raised and turning in the air like a woman conducting an orchestra she could not hear. They had a printed work order on a clipboard. They meant to take down my fence, regrade my drive, and begin clearing the building site that morning, on the strength of a board vote taken at a meeting I was never told of, on land they did not own and had never owned. I got out of my truck and walked into the gateway and put myself between the men and the chain. And I told them, plainly, to stop. For one moment, I was simply a man standing in a gravel road in front of a running machine. And my heart was going so hard I could feel it in my teeth. And the white heat behind my sternum was the worst it had ever been in 3 years. Diane came around the front of the company truck and pointed that finger at me. "Step aside, Mr. Brandt," she said loud for the men to hear. "The board has voted. This parcel is functionally ours and always has been, and we are exercising our authority. You can stand there and obstruct us, or you can be reasonable. But this work is happening today." She said it the way she had said everything for 3 years, certain, performing for an audience, never once having read the one document that would have told her she was wrong. I did not shout back at her. I did not put a hand on anyone. What I did was take out my phone And I called the sheriff's office first and gave them the address and said there were men cutting a private gate. And then I called Joan at the recorder's office and asked her to be ready. And while both calls went through, I read the claim number off the work order out loud, slow, and clear, so it landed on the recordings. Reese, who had texted me that the school had let out early for some teacher day, and who had gotten a ride up with Hank, was filming the whole thing from the cab of Hank's truck at the edge of the trees. Wide, steady, the time spoken out loud on the audio, the way we always did it now. 11 minutes the first year. She knew the drill cold. The deputy who came was Tom Alvarez. He pulled in behind the flatbed and got out, and he listened to Diane for about 90 seconds. And then he held up a hand and asked everyone to step back from the gate. He asked Diane for the legal authority to cut a private citizen's lock. She handed him the board's work order with great confidence. He read it. Then he asked me if I had documentation showing the parcel was mine. I told him it was all on the kitchen table, in the green binder, and that the county had certified copies. He told the crew to shut the machine down until the question of ownership was settled. And the question, he said, was going to be settled at the county, in front of people who could read a plat. That was Incident 31. The last one. The bolt cutters, the excavator, the work order, the husband's truck. I had it all. Dated, filmed, with a deputy's report attached. The wall Diane had built around herself was finished. All that remained was for her to stand inside it in public. She gave me that chance 2 weeks later at the association's annual meeting, the one where she read the vote. I need to slow down here, because this is the part of the story that matters most. And it did not happen the way you might expect. There was no shouting. There was no speech. There was a folding table, a coral blazer, a sheet of paper, and a green binder. The clubhouse was full that night. Word had gotten around about the machine at my gate. And the room was tense, half the faces curious, a few ashamed. Diane sat at the front behind the folding table with her attorney beside her and 2 board members flanking her. When the agenda reached my property, she stood, lifted her single sheet of paper, and read the vote that opens this story, the one where the board seized my cabin and gave me until the end of the month to remove my personal effects. She set the paper down. She looked at me with that thin smile. "Do you have anything to say, Mr. Brandt?" she asked, "before this becomes final?" I stood up. I did not have a speech. I had brought the green binder and one other thing, and I walked to the front of the room with the binder under my arm, and I set it on the folding table in front of her attorney, not in front of her. I opened it to the first plastic sleeve. I laid my grandfather's 1948 deed on the table. Next to it, I laid the 1981 recorded plat, and I put my finger on the corner of it, on the surveyor's seal, and I turned it so the attorney could read the name printed under the seal. The name under the seal was mine. "I ran this survey," I said. My voice was quiet. The room was very quiet. "In 1981, I set the boundary for your entire subdivision, and I drew my family's 4 acres as an in-holding outside your plat, because they were never inside the ranch your developer bought. This is the recorded plat. This is the recorded deed. The county certified both. I laid down the 3rd page, the lien, and the certified description beside it, and I put one finger on each. Your attorney swore to the county that my parcel falls under your covenants. Here is the description he swore to. Here is the description the county recorded. They do not match. He swore to something that is not true in writing, to file a lien on land your association has never owned. I did not say another word to Diane. I did not need to. I turned the binder so the attorney could read it himself, and I watched his face change. He read the two descriptions. He read the seal. He looked up at Diane, and then he leaned over and said something to her in a low voice that I could not hear and did not want to. And the color went out of her face, the way it goes out of a sky before weather. There was a county official in the room that night, a planning officer named Ellen who had come because of the complaints, and she asked to see the plat. I handed it to her. She read it for a long moment under the fluorescent lights. Then she set it down gently and said, to the whole room, that the parcel at the top of the road was not within the association's boundary, had never been, and that any vote concerning it was void on its face. She said the lien would have to be released, and that the sworn statement supporting it was a matter she would be referring elsewhere. Then she said the number that ended it. The association had levied, on paper, more than $11,000 in fines against my land over 3 years. The amount that had ever been lawfully owed was zero, not $1. The board had voted to seize 4 acres it did not own, on the strength of a lien sworn falsely, against a man who had drawn the very boundary they claimed crossed his land. The room sat with that for a moment. Nobody clapped. It was not that kind of moment. It was quieter and heavier than that. The sound of 40 people realizing at once that the woman at the front table had been wrong about the one thing she had built 3 years of certainty on, and that a retired surveyor with a green binder had known it the entire time and simply waited. I closed the binder, and I picked it up, and I went home to my daughter. The consequences came over the following months, and they fell exactly where Diane had pointed them. The false lien was released within the week. The county referred the sworn statement to the district attorney, and the association's attorney surrendered his ability to practice rather than fight it. The development company quietly ended its interest in the ridge once it became clear the Keystone parcel, my 4 acres, could never be assembled into their plan. And Diane's husband was no longer the head of land acquisition by Christmas, because a head of land acquisition who builds a 3-year scheme around land his wife never checked the title to is not an asset to anyone. Diane resigned the presidency before the next meeting. The seat she had used to come up my road was the same seat through which the whole thing was exposed. She lost, specifically and only, the thing she had tried to take. The cabin stayed mine. The 4 acres stayed mine. The view down the valley that her husband's company wanted to carve into lots is still pine forest. And I still walk the boundary every spring out to my grandfather's iron pin at the northeast corner, the one I know to the 100th of a foot. Reese is at college now, studying civil engineering, which, she will tell you, has nothing to do with the year a woman in a coral blazer tried to take her grandfather's cabin, and which I think has everything to do with it. The spring before she left, she helped me replant Carol's flower bed, the one the SUV flattened on the very first day. We put in the same flowers Carol used to grow. They come up every year now, by the porch, where her coffee cup used to sit, and where I keep the promise I made her, that I would not let it go to anyone, for any reason. I want to step out of the story now and tell you plainly what it taught, because that is the part you can use. If you own a piece of ground, go to the county recorder this month and pull your deed and the plat that surrounds it, and read the legal description until you understand exactly where your lines fall. Walk those lines on the ground. Find your corners. An authority that has not read the deed cannot beat the deed. And most overreach is just confidence that nobody will check. Check. Keep a record. When anyone with a clipboard tells you what you owe or what you must do, write down the date, the time, and what was said, and put it in a folder, and keep copies of everything you send and everything you receive. A documented pattern is the only thing that does not flinch when the pressure comes. You do not have to argue. You have to file. And do not answer overreach with anger. Answer it with paper. The day they vote to take what is yours, the calmest thing in the room is the person who already holds the title and already knows the lines. And that calm is not weakness. It is the strongest thing you can carry into a room full of people who never bothered to check. If you have a story like this, a clipboard, a gate, a vote that should never have happened, put it in the comments because I read them. And there is always one more out there. If this one was worth your evening, subscribe and stay close. Next time, I will tell you about the man who was told he could not put a dock on his own lake, and the 100-year-old water decree that said otherwise.